Dr. Elias Mercer walked through the front doors of Blackwood Memorial Hospital, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. The building was old, much older than any hospital he had ever worked in, and it smelled like dust, old books, and something else he couldn't quite place. It felt like the kind of place that had secrets hiding in every corner, but he tried to push the thought away. This was his first night shift here, and he needed to focus. The air felt thick with the weight of time, like it had been here forever, holding on to memories that no one could remember. Nurse Vivian Holloway stood by the nurse's station, her eyes scanning the hall, her posture stiff. She gave him a quick nod as he approached. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and something about the way she looked at him made him feel uneasy. "First night?" she asked, her voice too high-pitched to sound natural. "Yeah," Elias replied, glancing at her name tag. "I'm Dr. Mercer." "Vivian Holloway," she said, as if introducing herself. "You'll get used to the place." She hesitated for a second before continuing. "The night shift staff, they're a bit eccentric, but don't worry about them too much. Just follow the rules and everything will be fine." Elias nodded, but her words stuck in his mind. There was something strange about the way she spoke, as if she was warning him without saying it outright. But before he could say anything else, she quickly turned and walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Elias glanced around. The walls of the hospital looked like they hadn't been painted in decades. The floor tiles were cracked, and the lights above flickered, as if they were on the verge of going out. The place was huge, but it felt like something was always just out of reach. Every hallway seemed to stretch on longer than it should, and the quietness was almost deafening. As he made his way down the corridor, he spotted janitor Raymond "Ray" Calloway, hunched over as he pushed a mop down the hallway. Ray's eyes flicked up when Elias approached, and he gave him a quick nod. Elias stopped, trying to make small talk. "How long have you worked here?" "Long enough," Ray replied shortly, not looking up from the floor. He didn't seem particularly friendly, but he didn't seem unfriendly either. There was something strange about his behavior, though, like he was too jittery for someone who had worked here for so long. "Just follow the rules," Ray said, his voice low and almost too quiet to hear, "and everything will be fine." Elias tried to smile, but Ray had already turned away and continued mopping. Elias watched him for a moment, then shook his head, deciding it was best to move on. The farther he walked into the hospital, the stranger the atmosphere felt. The lights flickered more often now, casting long, twisted shadows along the walls. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft hum of the overhead lights. He passed a few rooms, their doors cracked open just enough to show an empty, sterile bed. It all seemed so quiet, so still. Finally, Elias reached room 104, the first room on his list. According to the chart, Samuel Grayson was the patient, but as Elias read the date, his brow furrowed. Samuel Grayson had been dead since 1987. Pushing the door open, Elias stepped inside. The room was too calm, too perfectly still. The bed was neatly made, the sheets perfectly tucked in. The air was cold, almost too cold for a hospital room. A hospital tray sat next to the bed, untouched, the food on it looking like it had been there for days. Elias glanced at the chart on the wall again. Samuel Grayson, died 1987. So why was the bed made? Why did it look like someone had just been in the room? He looked around, his eyes scanning the room carefully. Everything seemed in place, almost unnaturally so. He glanced up at the clock. It was stuck at 3 a.m. Elias's stomach tightened as he looked back at the room. The time was frozen, and there was no sign of life. The air felt too heavy in here, like something was waiting for him to notice something he wasn't supposed to. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it, a sense of being watched, as though someone was standing right behind him. He turned around quickly, his heart pounding in his chest, but the hallway outside the room was empty. No one was there. Shaking his head, Elias tried to laugh it off. It was just his imagination, right? He had to be tired after a long day. But as he turned back to look at Samuel's bed, a cold draft swept through the room, making the hairs on his arms stand up. He turned to face the window, but it was shut. He started to step backward, planning to leave the room and shake off the feeling of unease. But before he could even reach the door, a movement caught his eye. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, its shape barely visible in the shadows. It was still. So still that for a moment, Elias wondered if it was just another trick of the light. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure disappeared. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty hallway. He blinked. The figure was gone. His heart raced, his thoughts running wild. Had he seen something? Or had he imagined it? He stepped into the hallway, scanning the dark corridor. The silence felt even thicker now, almost suffocating. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that couldn't be explained. Suddenly, a voice whispered behind him, soft and almost breathless. "You're not supposed to be here." Elias spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. But when he turned, the hallway was empty. There was no one there. No figure, no person, just the dim, flickering lights above him and the deafening silence. He stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. Was it just his imagination? Was he hearing things? Or had someone really whispered to him? His mind raced with possibilities, but deep down, a cold fear began to take root. His instincts told him to leave. But he couldn't. Something was keeping him here, something pulling him deeper into the mystery of Blackwood Memorial. Something was wrong with this place. And the more he tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to claw its way to the surface. He slowly turned and walked back down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The sense of unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it in every fiber of his being. Something was waiting for him, and whatever it was much closer than he wanted to believe. As Elias walked, he glanced at the patient charts again. The names, the dates, the details, everything seemed so normal. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't. The longer he stayed here, the more he realized that Blackwood Memorial Hospital was hiding something, and he had only just begun to scratch the surface. Elias tried to steady his nerves. He had to find answers. His heart still raced as he walked down the dark corridor, his footsteps echoing louder than they should in the silence. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, he thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye. But when he looked, there was nothing there. He shook his head and kept walking. As he reached the nurse's station, he saw Vivian Holloway hunched over her desk, writing something down. Her face was illuminated by the harsh glow of the desk lamp, but she didn't look up when Elias approached. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights filled the room, and it was almost too still, too unnatural. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Vivian," he said, his voice a little sharper than he intended. "I was in room 104 earlier. Samuel Grayson, his chart said he died in 1987, but the room looked strange. The bed was made, but I didn't see anyone." Vivian didn't look up. Her pen continued to scratch against the paper, the only sound in the room. Finally, after a long moment, she lifted her head, her eyes distant, as if she hadn't fully heard him at first. When her gaze met his, it was cold, almost empty. "Don't ask questions about the patients, Dr. Mercer," she said, her tone clipped and unfriendly. "Just focus on your rounds. That's all you need to worry about." Elias felt a chill crawl down his spine. There was something about her tone, the way she said it, that sent a wave of unease through him. It was as though she wasn't just telling him to mind his own business. She was warning him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Blackwood Memorial than anyone was letting on. He nodded slowly, but he didn't take his eyes off her. "Right, I'll stick to my rounds." He turned and walked away, though he could still feel Vivian's gaze on him, following him as he made his way down the hall. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop thinking about room 104. Samuel Grayson. Why was the room so empty when the chart said the man had died nearly 40 years ago? He needed to clear his head. He needed to focus on the next patient. Elias pulled the chart from his pocket as he reached patient 207's room. Eleanor Finch. According to the file, she had died in 1992, almost 30 years ago. He could barely remember the last time he'd seen a patient with a chart that old. He didn't understand it, but there was no time to dwell on that now. He opened the door to room 207 and stepped inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from the small bedside lamp. The bed was perfectly made, the blankets smooth and neat. But then he saw her. Eleanor Finch sat up in bed, her back straight as a board, her eyes wide open, unnaturally wide. Her skin was so pale, almost translucent, as though the life had been drained from her. Her eyes, though, were what stood out the most. They were wide, empty, staring at him as if they could see right through him. He felt his stomach twist in an uncomfortable knot. Something was terribly wrong. "Miss Finch?" Elias asked, his voice a little shaky. "Can you hear me?" Her lips parted and a whisper slipped out. "You need to leave, before he finds you." The words sent a wave of cold through him, and Elias couldn't help but shiver. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with something unexplainable. The silence around them grew deafening, but Eleanor just sat there, staring at him, her face emotionless. "Who?" Elias asked, trying to hide the unease in his voice. "Who do I need to leave from?" But before he could get an answer, the moment was gone. His blink was enough. When he opened his eyes again, Eleanor Finch was gone. The bed was empty. His heart slammed against his chest as his breath quickened. The bed was still perfectly made, the pillows untouched. For a split second, he thought he had imagined it. But he knew better. He had seen her. He had heard her. He turned and quickly walked out of the room, his mind racing. What had just happened? He needed to get out of there, away from that room, away from everything. As he passed the doorway, he glanced down at the floor. A strange shadow was moving across the tile. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but then it shifted, too deliberate to be an accident. Elias stopped, looking down at it, but when he bent down to get a better look, the shadow disappeared. His pulse quickened. He was certain he hadn't imagined it. A low, guttural laugh echoed from behind him, the sound raspy and full of something dark. Elias spun around, his heart skipping a beat, but when he looked, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to catch his breath. His mind raced, his body tense. What was happening here? A whisper drifted through the air, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of fear through him. "You're not supposed to be here." Elias's chest tightened. The walls of the hospital felt as though they were closing in on him, pressing against him from all sides. His hands were clammy, and his breath came in shallow gasps. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. He turned, his eyes scanning the hallway, but there was nothing. No one. Just the shadows creeping along the walls, stretching and shifting with each flicker of the dying lights. He didn't know how much more he could take. The unease was suffocating, the air thick with something he couldn't explain. He needed to leave, but as he turned to head back to the nurse's station, something caught his eye. At the far end of the hallway, just past the last flickering light, he saw a figure. A man. The figure was dressed in a hospital gown, but there was something wrong. The man was standing perfectly still, staring at Elias with an intensity that made his skin crawl. But the worst part? The man had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, empty skin where his face should have been. Elias's heart skipped a beat, and his stomach twisted in horror. The figure stood there watching him, unmoving. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Elias couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He was locked in place, unable to move. Then, as quickly as the figure had appeared, it vanished. The hallway was empty again. Elias took a shaky breath, his pulse racing in his ears. What was happening here? What was Blackwood Memorial hiding? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far darker than he could understand. But it was too late to turn back now. Whatever it was, it had found him. And there was no going back. The faceless figure stepped closer, its movements unnervingly smooth. It walked like it knew the hospital better than Elias did, like it had been here for years, watching every corner, every hallway. Elias's heart hammered in his chest. He tried to move, to run, but his legs felt frozen, like the air itself was thick and heavy, pulling him down. The whispers started, faint at first, almost like the sound of wind rustling through leaves. But then they grew louder. They weren't just in his head anymore. They surrounded him, echoed in the sterile walls of the hospital. He could make out the words now. "He's coming for you. He's always watching." Panicked, Elias turned and sprinted down the hallway, trying to outrun the voice, the figure, the overwhelming dread that clung to him. But no matter how fast he ran, the whispers followed. "He's watching you. You can't escape." His pulse raced. He had to get out. He had to get away from whatever was chasing him. But the hospital seemed endless, stretching on forever in every direction. Without warning, a hand gripped his arm, yanking him into a dark, empty patient room. The door slammed shut behind them with a force that made the walls shake. Elias's breath came out in sharp gasps. He tried to pull away, but the hand held him firmly. It was Nurse Vivian Holloway. She looked at him with wide, fearful eyes, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. "Do not listen to him," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "Do not speak to him." Elias blinked in confusion. Who was she talking about? Before he could ask, the air around them seemed to grow thick, heavy with something dark and oppressive. The walls began to hum, low and eerie, like the building itself was alive, breathing. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, pressing against their ears. It was as if the sound was coming from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. "He's coming for you. He's waiting for you." The voices were so loud, so sharp, Elias felt like his head might explode. A shadow pressed against the door, thick and impenetrable. It felt as if something was standing just outside, its weight so heavy that Elias could feel it pushing against the room. His skin prickled, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, a voice, low, gravelly, like something that shouldn't exist. The word sent a chill down his spine. "I'm waiting for you." Elias froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was too close, right next to him, like it had come from inside the room. He turned, but there was nothing there. The shadow at the door seemed to stretch, grow longer, as if it was trying to slip through the cracks. Vivian shuddered, pulling him closer to her. "This hospital is cursed," she whispered, her voice shaking. "These aren't patients. They're trapped souls, waiting for release." Elias's mind spun. Trapped souls? What did that even mean? Was she talking about the figure with no face? Was it one of them? Before he could ask, the whispers stopped, as suddenly as they had started. The silence was deafening. Vivian slowly opened the door. The hallway outside looked the same, except it didn't. Something was wrong. The walls seemed darker, more worn. The hospital, once so familiar, felt different, alien, like it had shifted when he wasn't looking. He looked up at the sign above the door. It read, "Blackwood Asylum." Elias's stomach twisted. This wasn't right. This wasn't the same hospital he had been walking through just moments ago. Was he hallucinating? Had the building really changed? Or was it something else? Something worse? He looked back at Vivian, but her face was as tense as ever, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't say anything, but Elias could feel the weight of her gaze, as if she too could sense the shift in the air. The hospital, the building, was alive, and it had been watching him all along. With a glance down the hall, the world around him seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. What had just happened? What was Blackwood really hiding? And who, or what, was waiting for him? The answers were out there, somewhere in the dark corners of Blackwood Asylum. But Elias wasn't sure he was ready to find them. He and Vivian moved cautiously down the hallway, disoriented. The hospital had changed again. The floors seemed to shift beneath their feet, and the walls bent at odd angles, as if they were alive. Every time they thought they were heading in the right direction, they ended up somewhere else. Elias rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion and fear pulling at him. The building didn't make sense anymore. It felt like it was stretching, warping, and reconfiguring itself with each step they took. Vivian's breath came fast, her hand gripping Elias's arm tightly. "What's happening? Why is it like this?" Elias didn't have an answer. He could barely make sense of the things he'd already seen, let alone this madness. He just wanted to get out, to find something familiar, something that might explain the nightmare unfolding around them. Then, a flicker caught his eye, one of the security cameras. It blinked to life, the red light turning on. Then another, and another, until they all lit up in sequence. A chill ran through Elias's spine. The cameras had never been active before. They were supposed to be broken. The screens in the lobby showed something strange. Figures in hospital gowns stood motionless, lined up along the walls. They didn't move. They didn't even blink. But Elias could feel their eyes on him. Every one of them, their empty stares following him and Vivian as they moved down the hall. He shivered, feeling the weight of their gaze like a physical presence. He tried to look away, but his eyes kept drifting back to them, his heart racing with fear. A low, raspy voice echoed from one of the monitors, sending a shock of panic through his body. "You're not supposed to be here." Elias froze. His blood ran cold, his stomach sinking. The voice came from somewhere deep inside the monitor, its tone full of malice and warning. It wasn't like anything he had heard before. Not human. Something darker, more ancient. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Then, suddenly, the face of Ray Calloway, the janitor, appeared on the screen. His face was wide-eyed, frantic, and sweaty. "Get out! They're everywhere! He's coming for you!" Ray's voice was shaking. His words rushed, like he was trying to warn them of something terrible, something that couldn't be stopped. Before Elias could respond, a shadowy hand reached up from the bottom of the screen and covered Ray's mouth. His eyes bulged, and he struggled, but the hand pressed harder, silencing him. Then, with a flicker, the screen went black. Elias's heart raced as he turned to Vivian, fear in her eyes matching his own. "We need to find him. Now." They ran towards the security office, every step echoing in the hollow silence. Elias's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was Ray dead? Had he been taken? And what was that thing watching them through the cameras? When they reached the security office, they found it abandoned. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist. But the most unsettling thing was Ray's uniform. It lay crumpled on the floor, as if he had just removed it and left in a hurry. Elias bent down, inspecting the uniform. It was still warm, as if someone had just been wearing it. His hand brushed against it, and his stomach churned. Where was Ray? What had happened to him? Suddenly, a movement caught Elias's eye. In the corner of the room, a figure stood. It was patient 207, Eleanor Finch. Her face was pale, lifeless, her eyes hollow and dark. She didn't move, but Elias could feel her watching him, her gaze like a weight pressing down on him. His breath caught in his throat. "Vivian, look." Vivian turned slowly, her face drained of color. But before she could react, Elias blinked, and when he looked back, Eleanor was gone, vanished without a trace. But the air was still thick with the sound of her whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Don't trust her." Elias stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The walls groaned, a low, deep sound that made his bones ache. It wasn't just the walls. The whole building seemed to be alive, responding to something, trying to communicate something he couldn't understand. It felt like the hospital was trying to tell them something. But what? He looked at Vivian, whose face had gone pale. She was staring at the door, her hands shaking. "We need to leave. Now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was watching them, waiting for them to make a move. The walls creaked again, louder this time, and Elias felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes on him, like the hospital itself was alive, breathing in the darkness. The silence felt unbearable. They were trapped. There was nowhere to run. Elias pulled Vivian closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It only grew stronger the longer they stood still. The walls seemed to close in on them. It was as if the building itself had become part of the nightmare. "Come on," he whispered, his voice tight. "We need to keep moving. We can't stay here." Vivian nodded, her face pale, her body tense. They made their way down the hallway, trying to ignore the constant groaning of the walls. They had to find a way out. But with every step, the hallways twisted in ways they didn't remember. Finally, after what felt like hours of wandering, they stumbled into the operating wing. The cold, sterile surgical rooms felt like a mockery of safety. The lights above flickered intermittently, casting long shadows on the floor. The rooms looked empty at first, but there was something off about them. It was as if they were waiting for someone. Everything was arranged too perfectly, too deliberately, almost as if the hospital was preparing for a new patient, but they didn't know who. "This doesn't feel right," Vivian murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Elias didn't answer. His mind was racing. There had to be answers here, but he could feel the heavy presence of something dark lingering in the air. They moved deeper into the wing, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. They eventually came across Chief Surgeon Malcolm Hargrove's office. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room with a single light hanging from the ceiling. The desk was cluttered with old medical files, papers scattered across the surface. But something caught Elias's eye. There, on the wall, was a portrait of Hargrove. But the man in the portrait didn't look like the living Malcolm Hargrove. Not at all. The figure in the painting was a decrepit, dead man, his skin pale and lifeless. His eyes were hollow, his expression twisted into a grotesque smile. Elias felt his stomach churn as he stared at it. "What is this?" Vivian breathed, stepping back. "I don't know," Elias muttered, trying to push the image from his mind. "Let's just keep moving." As if the hospital had been listening, a low groan echoed through the halls. The sound of metal scraping against stone sent a chill down Elias's spine. It was unnatural, like something large and heavy dragging itself along the floor. Vivian's eyes widened. "We need to go. Now." Elias didn't argue. He turned quickly, pulling her with him, but as they walked deeper into the operating wing, they came across an operating room. This one was different. The room felt alive, buzzing with an energy that sent shivers down their spines. The tools on the table were sharp, meticulously arranged, as if they'd been used recently. The scent of blood hung heavy in the air, thick and metallic. Elias gagged, the smell overpowering. There was no way they were the first ones to have come through here. Something, or someone, had been using this room. The thought made his skin crawl. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, a twisted woman, dressed in a blood-stained hospital gown. Her skin was pale, her face gaunt, and her eyes were hollow, empty sockets where her eyes should have been. She looked like something that had been buried for decades, only to claw its way back to the surface. The hollow nurse. Elias's heart stopped as she moved toward them, her footsteps slow, deliberate, mechanical, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. She lifted a scalpel from the table, its sharp edge gleaming in the low light. Her movements were unnerving, as if she'd been performing surgeries for years, decades, without rest. "Run!" Elias shouted, panic surging through him. He grabbed Vivian's arm and yanked her toward the door. But as they turned to flee, Vivian collapsed. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor with a sickening thud. Elias caught her just in time, but her skin had turned an unnatural gray, like the life had drained out of her. "Vivian?" Elias gasped, his hands shaking as he tried to lift her. "Vivian, please!" A small incision appeared on her arm, as if someone had sliced her open with a blade. But neither of them could remember how it had happened. There was no sign of the hollow nurse. No sound of footsteps. It was as if she had never been there at all. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he realized something terrible. The blood staining Vivian's arm wasn't hers. Her skin was too gray, too lifeless. The hollow, vacant look in her eyes only confirmed it. Vivian wasn't Vivian anymore. She was one of them now, a lost patient, trapped in the hospital just like the others. Elias's world shattered. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest as he stared at her, unable to comprehend what had just happened. This wasn't possible. He couldn't lose her too. But there was no time to think. He had to move. They had to get out. But the hospital was changing again, shifting, trapping them inside its walls. Elias turned, looking for an escape, but the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly before him, leading to nowhere. He was alone with something far worse than he could have imagined. Vivian's body was still in his arms, but it was wrong. So wrong. Her skin stretched unnaturally, as if something was pulling it from the inside out. Elias could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a frantic beat that matched the panic creeping up his throat. Her breath was shallow, labored. Every exhale rattled in her chest like she was suffocating. "Vivian?" Elias whispered, his voice shaking. But there was no response, only the sound of her ragged breathing. Then, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, she whispered, softly, barely a breath at first. "Help me." Elias froze. His heart stopped. He looked down at her. Her eyes, her beautiful, once bright eyes, were now hollow, completely empty. Her pupils were gone, replaced by two black, endless voids. She was still mouthing the words, "Help me," but the voice that came out was nothing like hers. It was cold, hollow, like the voice of someone dead. "Vivian," he gasped, his hands trembling as he tried to shake her. But she didn't respond. The sound of her dead voice echoed in his mind, growing louder, more frantic. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. The person in his arms wasn't the woman he had known. The operating room doors flew open on their own, slamming against the walls with a deafening crash. The sound rattled Elias's bones. He didn't want to go in. He didn't want to move, but something inside him, something dark and powerful, pulled him toward the room. He resisted, but it was like an invisible force was guiding him. He fought, desperately trying to break free from whatever was pulling him toward the door. He needed to get out of here. He had to get away from this nightmare. But no matter how hard he tried to turn back, his feet kept moving toward the operating room. Inside, the room was cold and sterile, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic. The surgical table in the center of the room was covered in restraints, as if something, was meant to be strapped to it. Elias felt a sickening urge to struggle against it, to fight whatever force was pulling him forward, but it was getting harder to breathe. It was like the walls were closing in, and he was suffocating in the hospital's cold grip. He ran. He didn't look back. He sprinted through a series of rooms, each one more twisted than the last. There were patients on life support, their bodies twitching violently as if their minds were still fighting to stay alive. But their eyes were vacant, empty. There was no life left in them. Elias's stomach churned as he passed by, unable to stop himself from glancing at their twisted forms. He had to get out. He had to escape. His feet carried him down another hallway, and suddenly, as he passed by a room with a large window, he saw it. The outside world. The first glimpse of the hospital's exterior. But it wasn't what he expected. The walls of the hospital were cracking. Pieces of the building were floating, suspended in mid-air like they were held by some invisible force. The ground beneath his feet felt unsteady, as if it was shifting, warping. The hospital itself was breaking apart, tearing at the seams. The shadows in the windows moved, flickering like something was watching him from within the walls. The air hummed with a low, almost deafening energy, vibrating through his bones. And then the voice, louder now, urgent, commanding, spoke again. "You're not supposed to be here." Elias's blood ran cold. The words were louder than before, echoing in his mind. They weren't just a warning anymore. They were a command. The hospital wasn't just alive, it was alive with purpose. Purpose that didn't include him. He stumbled back, the realization sinking in like a stone in his chest. The truth crashed over him like a wave. This hospital, it wasn't a place of healing. It wasn't even a place of life. It was something far darker, far more twisted. The walls, the floors, the rooms, they were all part of something greater. Something that fed on the broken, on the lost souls that wandered its halls. And he wasn't a patient. He wasn't a visitor. He was part of its twisted experiment. A subject. A specimen. The hospital had been watching him all along, guiding him to this point, trapping him in its endless nightmare. And if he didn't get out, if he didn't escape, he would become just another lost soul. Another body to join the countless others that had already been consumed by this place. Elias turned, looking for any way out, but the hospital had already shifted. The hallways were endless, twisting in ways that made no sense. The doors wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut. The walls pulsed, alive with an energy that felt like it was closing in on him. He wasn't just running from the hospital anymore. He was running from himself, from everything he had ever known. There was no escape. He was trapped. And he didn't know how long he had before the hospital claimed him too. Elias's legs felt weak, but he forced himself to move. The hallways twisted and turned in every direction, stretching endlessly in front of him. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on him. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. He couldn't think straight. Every corner he turned led him deeper into the maze of the hospital, farther from any chance of escape. Then, in the distance, he saw a door. It was different from the others. Something about it stood out, like it was the only way out. He ran toward it, heart pounding in his chest, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hallway. But as he reached the door, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. In the center of the room stood a large mirror. Elias stepped forward, his eyes drawn to it, unable to look away. The reflection in the glass was wrong. The hospital in the mirror didn't look like the one he had been running through. It was warped, bent, as though it had never existed in the real world at all. The walls seemed to stretch and twist in impossible ways, and the lights flickered in strange patterns. It wasn't just a reflection, it was something else. Something alive. Something hungry. He took a step closer to the mirror, his breath catching in his throat. The voice whispered again, colder now, more urgent. "You're the last one left." Elias froze. The words didn't make sense. What did it mean? He looked into the mirror, searching for something, anything, that would make him understand. That's when he saw it. His reflection. At first, it seemed normal. But then he saw the truth. It wasn't him. The reflection staring back at him wasn't alive. It was the dead version of himself. His eyes were empty, lifeless, like the eyes of someone who had long since passed. His face was pale, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He was cold, hollow, like a corpse that had been forgotten in a morgue. He reached out toward the mirror, his hands shaking, desperate to touch his reflection. But the glass stopped him. He couldn't feel the warmth of his own skin. There was no warmth. No life. The reflection remained frozen, staring back at him with those empty eyes. The voice spoke again, louder this time, almost mocking. "You're already part of the hospital. You can never leave." Elias's heart skipped a beat. The truth hit him like a punch to the stomach. The words were real. They were true. He wasn't alive anymore. He hadn't been alive for a long time. In that moment, everything clicked. The twisted hospital, the patients, the voices, the endless corridors. He was already dead. He had been from the very beginning. And now he was part of this place. Part of the hospital's twisted cycle. There was no escaping. There was no leaving. The hospital had claimed him, just like it had claimed everyone else. Elias turned, his legs unsteady beneath him, his mind racing. He had to leave. He had to get out. He couldn't just accept this. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. He stumbled toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. But as he touched it, the truth slammed into him with full force. The door didn't open. It was locked. There was no way out. He wasn't meant to leave. He wasn't allowed to leave. His body shook with a sickening realization. The hospital had him. It had always had him. He had been a part of this place all along, just another lost soul wandering its halls, trapped in its never-ending nightmare. He looked back at the mirror one last time. His dead reflection stared back at him, unmoving, lifeless. There was no escape from this place. There was no escape from the truth. Elias dropped to his knees, tears welling in his eyes, but even they felt hollow. He had nothing left. Nothing but the endless, dark halls of Blackwood Memorial and the twisted, broken cycle that would never end.